He's being Sarge too.
No. There's only one Sarge here.
So we might as well go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for coming. This is our third seminar in our fall speaker series. And hopefully this won't disappoint. We shall see. First of all, I'd like to introduce Norman Turner. He's got an announcement he'd like to make.
I don't know how many in here get the Franklin paper other than us, but October the 12th paper shows a picture here of the All City High School class of 1942 meeting for their 75th reunion. There was, I believe, 7 of them. But anyway, on the back of the paper then it shows a picture of them when they graduated, and also the picture was taken when they had the reunion. The reason I bring this to you, how many know Marjorie Hummel?
Oh, yeah, John.
She was in that class.
Oh, remember John?
So this paper will be available to anybody that's interested. They can have a look at it.
Pass it around.
Yeah.
That'll be practice. We're going to be passing lots of stuff around tonight.
No homework.
Huh?
Corey, can you see him here?
He's fine.
You got a cold?
Okay, I think I know all of you, so no need for introductions. I do want to thank Jane Cleary and Kathy Coulter, who suggested that I do this presentation tonight. This is Family History Month, and they knew that I was working on genealogy from my mom's side of the family, from over in Hickory Township. So that's what I'm going to present tonight, and I'm sure you're wondering what the connection is with Grove City, but my family has some connections, so we'll discover those as we go through this adventure together. My mom was the genealogist of the family. She died in 1994, and everything stopped at that point. My grandparents always wanted me to continue, but at that point I had 2 little kids, was working full-time and traveling, so I didn't have time to touch it. But I did save all her folders, and when she was working she had no computer, so she couldn't do internet searches or anything. She had to request immigration records in writing, send correspondence, and request those. She did a lot of microfilm searches up at the Mercer County Historical Society. She traipsed around cemeteries and old family homesteads. So I just am in disbelief now, the amount of information that's available on the internet, and it's so easy to get to. What would take her days or weeks, I can have at my fingertips in seconds. So I just find that pretty amazing. So let's get started here. Okay, why the focus on Hickory Township? Back in April, I went to a meeting at the Hermitage Historical Society, where I'm also a member, and at that meeting they had the Hickory High School History Club do a presentation on the history of Hickory Township. Their advisor explained that that is the only way his students learned about the history of the township was through that history club. They didn't get it in any of the regular classes. During the presentation, he asked anybody to share information that they knew of relatives, family members that lived in the township. My kids warned me before I went not to be the teacher's pet, but if you all know me, I can't keep my mouth shut. So probably within the first 5 minutes when they started talking about the Erie Extension Canal, my hand went up and I was sharing information about my family in Hickory Township. So when the whole presentation was over, the advisor asked me if any of this history was recorded, and it, to my knowledge, had not been. And he asked if I would be willing to record it and share the history with his students so that they would have a family to follow through the development of the township. So that's why I'm focusing on this branch of the family in Hickory Township. So, well, let me see, just a little background about the township. Their first settlers were in 1796, and farming was the primary means of living at that time. The township was incorporated in 1832. Coal was discovered in 1835, so there was a real boom at that point. The canal, the Erie Extension Canal, opened in 1844, and the railroad was completed in 1860. So western Pennsylvania and Hickory Township were, it was all a land of opportunity. There was a lot of strife going on in Europe, political tensions at the time, so those people were getting out and coming to America, settling here. So most of my family came from Germany, and that side of the family came from Germany, but there were some from England as well. One of your handouts is a family tree, and you're welcome to follow along as we go through these. Didn't do anything fancy, but there is a family tree there that shows the relatives we're going to cover. And I also have a map of Hickory Township, which I'll talk about a little bit. When the township was first incorporated, it was 39 square miles, and it included the communities of Sharon, Wheatland, Sharpsville, and then Farrell was down in this area. So this is a map of the township, and I'll show you where everybody settled. Okay, the first couple that I'd like to introduce to you are Constantine Nye and his wife Katharina, and they came from Germany. I do say this to them. I have a map of the German Federation, and this included sections of Germany and Europe. Hanover, relatives came from Prussia, Saxony, and Bavaria. So if we can pass this around and see where all these people are coming from. Constantine's last name was originally spelled N-E-Y. Family history says that he may have been related to Marshal Nye, that was an aide to Napoleon. Could have been one of the reasons he was getting out of the country. He was born in 1827, came to the United States in 1848, and I was able to find out that the ship he came on was the Orion. Family history also tells us that he spoke 5 languages when he came, and I just wonder if it was the 5 different languages of that German Federation. That it would make sense to me that those were the languages that he knew. And then he married Katharina. We don't know hardly anything about her. We don't know her maiden name. We know that she was born in 1829 in Bavaria. And she came to the United States in 1852, and they were married the next year. I don't even have any pictures of her that I found yet. And I am still pouring through boxes of pictures that came from my mother and my grandparents. They first settled at Clay Furnace, where he worked, and if you remember our local history, Clay Furnace was the first iron blast furnace in the area. They produced iron there, and he worked in the furnace. They had one child, Andrew. He was born at Clay Furnace in 1854. By the 1860 census, they had relocated to Big Beaver in Lawrence County, where he worked as a coal miner. By the 1870 census, they were back at Clay Furnace. There's Cody. This is my son Cody, my husband Bob, my daughter Mallory. They're helping out tonight, so. Thanks for coming. Okay, in 1874, at a cost of $725, Andrew and Katerina bought a two-acre plot in Hickory Township. It had the house and the barn on it. There's a color picture of it over there next to Norman. And we'll be looking at this again during our presentation tonight. And this place he bought off of a man named Joseph Graham, and it was right on what is now State Street in Hermitage. So if we look at this map of Hickory Township, this is State Road. It goes right through the middle of the township. That's now State Street, East State Street. If you're familiar with the area and know where Denny's restaurant is, that was Graham's house on the corner, and Constantine bought the house right next to them. They owned that house as well, and he bought the house next to them. So it would have been east of where Denny's restaurant is today. And once they were located there, he really got out of the mining work and practiced his trade as a carpenter. He was known for the cabinets that he made and clocks. So he repaired clocks and made new ones as well. My brother has the tool chest that he brought over from Germany. Still's got the old wooden tools in it and planes and stuff. So excuse me for getting So he died in 1902 at age 75, left his entire estate to his only child, Andrew. But I have a copy of the will, and it very specifically says he was charged to take care of his mother until her death. So he had to provide a home for her and pay for all her expenses until her death. And she died about 2 years later in 1904.
Did she change the spelling of her name?
Yes, she did. And you'll see that. It's amazing, but 3 sets of great-great-great-grandparents, the wives were all named Catherine, or some variation of that name. So, and they spelled it different ways, but and a lot of them Americanized their names after they got over here. Or else immigration did it for them. So the second set of great-great-great-grandparents were John Blombeck and his wife, Catherine. They were both born in the Hanover, Prussia area of that German Federation, what became the German Federation. And they were married in Prussia in 1850. They had two children while they were still in Europe, Henry and Mary. And see, their names were Americanized as well. Now, I didn't find this information in my mother's notes, but I did find, you'll see up front, I have 4 volumes of Mercer County history through the years. And I was amazed to find that many of my ancestors' biographies were in those books. And in one of them, I found that John Blombeck came to the United States, and after a short while, he moved to Canada for 2 years and then came back. I haven't found any immigration records. I'm going to have to ask Jane and Kathy Polder to help me with that. But when he came here, then went to Canada, and then came back, I don't know how we find him. But I did find the records with Catherine coming to the United States with the 2 children in 1857, and they came on the steamboat Beau Russia. And I found a picture of the steamboat. It had 3 masts with sails, but you can see the black smoke pouring out of it, and that was the steamboat. Regular sailing ships, they said, took about 5 weeks to come across. They came across in in 3 weeks. Okay, and we don't know, the dates are very vague with the Bombeck's. At some point, we know he was in Wheatland. The biography in the Mercer County History said that he worked as a boatman on the Erie Extension Canal, and that he was an engineer at the blast furnace in Wheatland. Now, there were 2 furnaces built in 1863. This referred to a singular furnace, so that's, I think, he was there at least in 1863 when that furnace opened, when they talked about it in the singular. He was also a carpenter by trade, and he later got a job working on the railroad line between Oil City and Franklin, and then he worked as a coal miner. They had 2 more children, William and Elizabeth, and I had a picture of all the family on the last, whoops, wrong way, back up. That was the Bombeck's. Catherine and John are seated, and then their daughter Mary is standing in the back next to Henry, and then Elizabeth, the youngest, is seated in the front. The mine that John worked in was the Strawbridge Carver mine, and on this map of the township, it's right here. It's right along State Road, and it is where Forker Boulevard and State Road intersect, just before you get down into Sharon. It maybe is in Sharon, I'm not sure, but it was located right there. There were a whole bunch of mines down in there. It's right near Sharon High School. You know, sometimes reading the paper where they've had a sinkhole from one of the mines caving in. Well, this mine did cave in, and John was in that mine collapse. It broke his back, and then he died 3 days later. They were able to get him out, but he was 51 when he died, and then she lived till she was 70. And later census say that she made her home with her children, so either William or Henry she lived with until she died.
Did any of your research say how many other people died in that?
No. Haven't found it. You can tell Cody hasn't read my history. Well, maybe that wouldn't have been covered in there.
It's laying on the kitchen table.
That wouldn't have been covered in there. I haven't found that out. Okay, the third set of great-great-great-grandparents that settled in Hickory Township were the Millers, Matthias Miller, and I did find the immigration records with him. You can see that the name was spelled Muller when they first came over, which was common, but they Americanized it to Miller. He was born October 4th, 1820 in Bavaria. She was also from Bavaria. She was born in 1827. Catherine Foltz was her name. They were married while they were still in Bavaria in 1847, and they had one son, Christian, when they left to come to the United States. And they traveled on the ship Harbinger. They left Le Havre, France, and arrived in the United States in 1850. They originally settled in Greenville, but then they came to Hickory Township, where he also worked as a coal miner. So that was the trade of the day. But he saved up enough money working as a coal miner that they were able to buy a farm in Hickory Township, and it was south of Keel Ridge. Now, growing up, I was always told that the Miller farm was south of State Street, but east of Route 18. And if I was ever shown the property, I don't remember, but I've often wondered where it was. And through this research, I found it. When Katharina died, there that one again. Forward and back, right?
No.
Is it going to go up?
What's the message say?
Restart.
Restart.
Restart required.
Anyways, it's down the corner, it's all right. Just so it doesn't shut off.
Okay, we gotta go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Or didn't you do anything?
Didn't do anything. Just think about that.
We're still not far enough ahead. Is that where we are? Anyways, they bought this farm. I had a 1920 picture of the farmhouse. And Catherine's obituary said she died at her home near Robinson's Grove in Hickory Township. And I thought, where in the heck is Robinson's Grove? Searched this map for it, and I did know their property is marked here. His name is on this map. This map is from 1873, and his name is on here. So, but I couldn't tell where this was. I thought maybe the Home Depot area, behind Home Depot, maybe south of there. But when I was over at the Hermitage picnic, the Society's picnic over there, I took my 1920 picture, and I had a picture my mom had taken in the 80s, and I said, where is Robinson's Grove? And they said, well, Robinson was the train that ran at Keel Ridge, and the last stop was at Robinson's Grove. There was a picnic area across at the end of the station, across the way there, and people would take the train to that last station, and that's where they'd have picnics. And I said, okay, where is Robinson Grove? Where is it? And he said, Rod told me, he said, Robinson Road. And I said, there is no Robinson Road. Well, it's been changed to Moorfield Road. So if you go to Hermitage, turn left at, well, it's the BP station there before you get to Agway. That's South Keel Ridge Road. You go down there a couple blocks, and then you turn right on Moorfield Road, and then you make a left and another right and a left. And there was the Miller's house.
Oh, wow.
So that's a 2017 picture of the Miller house. And they went on to have 8 more children. One was Matthias Jr., and Matthias Jr. was my great-great-grandfather. He ended up buying his mother and dad's house and raised his 3 kids there. So, 4 kids. He had 4 kids. And so my great-grandmother, 3 generations lived in that house. Okay, so that was another adventure we had, finding that house. And the Ormsby was a big name in Hickory Township. He had a lot of coal mines and other businesses. The Mercer County History talks about him sinking a coal mine shaft on the Miller property in 1870. It was called the Miller Bank, and by 1877, the history says they were producing 250 tons a day. And I thought that was a massive amount of coal to be producing when it was a lot of manual labor. So I don't know whether that number is right or not. And I also learned that the Millers were very involved in the German Reformed Church, and they had been, a small congregation had been meeting in a home that's at Trout Corner, where Denny's restaurant and Burger King are today. That was referred to as Trout's Corner. But there was a congregation meeting there where Burger King is today. And the Millers were very much involved with that. 1874, he was on the committee to find a location to build a new church. And they found that, and he was on the building committee. So that congregation is still in existence today. It's known as St. Paul's United Church of Christ in Hermitage. And then Mr. Ormsby also had a mercantile business, and it was right at the corner where Walgreens drugstore is today. So I'm sure it was probably sitting in the middle of the intersection. That's probably 5 or 6 lanes right there. But that's the general location where the mercantile was. And in that building was also a post office. So Matthias became postmaster until he died in 1877, or 1891. And then Catherine and several of the children continued to run their farm, the mercantile, and the post office. And then she died in 1904. Her obituary also stated that she had been a pioneer resident of the county. Okay, and I find it ironic that all 3 sets of those great-great-great-grandparents were leaving that political unrest in Germany at the time that we were having so much unrest here leading up to the Civil War. I wonder what they thought when they got here and found out what was going on. Okay. The last set of great-great-great-grandparents were the Oakses, Robert Oakes, and he married Nancy Bailey. They came from England. This white area on the map is Staffordshire, and she came from Manchester, which is a little bit to the north, if you want to get a feel for where they came from. He was born in 1831, and she was born in 1834. He came to the United States on the ship Henry Clay, and our Oakes family history states they left Liverpool on a sailing vessel in January, arriving in New York 5 weeks later. From here to Buffalo, New York by train, thence by canal boat to Greenville, Pennsylvania, arriving March 4th, 1851. I thought, what a trek. So 5 weeks coming across, and then the train ride, and then the coming down by canal. So the family, he actually came with his parents, which would be 4 great-grandparents, and they settled in Greenville, but then again, he came to Hickory Township and worked as a coal miner. Nancy left England when she was only 9 with her family. They came to West Salem Township, I think, which is south of Greenville. I should have looked that up, but I didn't. And they were married in the late 50s. I haven't found the exact date yet. And guess what? They purchased a farm in Hickory Township. And their farm was on North Kill Ridge Road. And I didn't know exactly where, and I know that I never heard as a child where they lived. But in my mother's notes, I found a little notation down the corner, Frank Dubé's house, and the phone number. So I called the number, it was disconnected. Looked Frank Dubé up in the phone book, couldn't find him. And there was a number there, and it was also disconnected. So again, back at the Hermitage Historical Society picnic, I asked, do you know if there's a Frank Dubé anywhere on North Kill Ridge Road? Well, of course, they knew exactly where it was. And we went and found that house that night. And this is it. So, North Kill Ridge Road. So when you're coming down into Hermitage, instead of turning left at the BP station and just before Agway, you turn right. And the house is back there on the right. Yeah, it's up here. I know you can't see my little green dots, but you can look at it later. So, now, also going through my grandmother's papers, I found this article from the Allied News, and it was dated, oh, I forgot to cover their death. Let's cover that. Nancy was only 44 when she died, and Robert married again in 1880, 2 years later, and he married Nancy's widowed sister. Just keep it all in the family. He died in 1910. Okay, then I find this article in the paper, and it's our Allied News, January 1979, talks about the Filer House, and it's 14th in a series on Wolf Creek, Pine Grove, and Grove City, and it was written by Lillian Rear. And I'm thinking, why in the world would this be in my grandmother's documents? So I started reading it, and partway through it talks about the Filer House, this hotel in town, being owned by Joseph Filer and his wife, Rachel Oakes. So I thought, okay, what's the connection here? And here, Rachel was Robert's sister, who also immigrated in 1851. She married Joe Filer. He was a coal operator and miner in Greenville, and they moved to Pine Grove, which is now Grove City. And then they bought the Filer House, or they bought the hotel and renamed it the Filer House. And it was right down at the corner of Broad and Pine Street. I think Citizens Bank is in there right now, on that corner. So there's our first connection with these relatives to Grove City. And I had to email Lillian as soon as I found that, and I said, I can't believe that she had written that article. And then, sure enough, I got out my copy of our Wolf Creek Legacy that we published here a few years ago, and there's that article right on page 40. So thank you, Lillian. That's why I wanted her here tonight, Terry. So there again is more of my family history in these books. This book is for sale here at the Historical Society. I have to do an ad for them. So the other tidbit here, Joseph and Rachel had 5 children, and their son W.H. Filer had 5 boys, and they started business together as the 5 Filer brothers. So I know most of you in this room remember that business. So their grandmother was Rachel Oakes. Okay, now we move on to the second generation, and with all of these but one, they were born here in the United States. And these are my great-great-grandparents. Andrew, as you remember, was the only child of Constantine and Catherine Nye. He was born 1854 at Clay Furnace.
Where's Clay Furnace?
It's between Mercer, it's a little bit to the north of 62 as you're on your way from Mercer to Hermitage.
Okay, thank you.
There's an historical marker there
Yeah.
too.
Oh, okay, I'll have to
Yeah.
watch next.
South of Charleston,
I thought it was
Past-
further
Perry.
west of Charleston. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
gives me the idea.
Yeah, there's a historical marker there. Let's see it. I think it's just before you come into Hermitage, isn't it?
No,
Well, the Hermitage
Line is
line
probably out
is
there.
right beyond that road that goes, it says Clay Furnace Road.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Lost your track.
Now, Andrew apprenticed as a butcher, and he did his training over in Kinsman, Ohio. And again, another story I never heard growing up was that he met Lizzie Engel while he was over there, married her, and then just a short time afterward, she was trampled by cattle and died. So we don't have much information on Lizzie, but I do have a copy of their marriage certificate. So that's how I knew about Lizzie. So then he came back to Hickory Township, and he operated meat wagons in Sharon and Farrell. You know, his dad had the small farm there, and they would buy beef, and he would butcher them. He would ice down the meat wagon, and then horse-drawn, take that to Sharon and Farrell, and deliver fresh-cut meat to customers along the way. Now, he married Mary Bombeck, and we talked a little bit about her parents. Her dad worked on the canal and was crushed in the coal mining accident. She had come over from Prussia in 1857 with her mother and her brother, and we know that she grew up in Wheatland. One thing that I always heard growing up was that she drove mules on the Erie Extension Canal, and I always thought how horrible to send a 9-year-old child to do that job. Well, then it was through this research I found that her dad, John, was a boatman on the canal, so I'm hoping he was on the canal boat and she was riding the mules on the tow path next to it. But she would go from Wheatland to New Hamburg and then spend the night there and then make the return trip the next day. So if we go back to our map, Wheatland's down here. This solid black line is the canal. This is up above Sharpsville, and New Hamburg is up even further. It was Pymatuming Township then. I think it's Delaware Township now. So I don't feel so awful about John Bombeck now if he was along with her on that canal boat. But my mom always referred to her as the mule driving grandmother. Andrew and Mary were married in 1885, and in 1892 they purchased property at Trout's Corner, and they bought the property right next to Andrew's father, Constantine. So back over here, his property was right where Denny's restaurant is today. And I have an aerial photo of that whole corner from when they were selling the property much later on. And Andrew bought this house here on, I don't know that you can see it in the back, but Andrew bought this house on the corner, and Constantine's house was here. And over the years, they were able to purchase all of this. This was the old Hickory Plaza, and it goes right up to Kmart. We're the backside of Kmart today. So if you can see that. They owned that whole corner. Now, he was still a butcher. Well, they had 4 children at that house. Trout School was on that property. And I know that because on our Hickory Township map in 1873, Trout School was already listed on there. And my great-grandfather and his brothers and sister and my grandfather all went to Trout one-room school over there. I'm still researching that history, but that happened to be on their property. Remember, he was a butcher. He taught Mary the butchering trade and all 4 children. They had 3 boys and a girl, and they all worked in the business. And they eventually built a slaughterhouse, and it was back behind Constantine's house, so it's right back here. They didn't raise a lot of their own beef and animals. They would buy from the neighboring farmers, and later on they bought them from further away, so. And would have them brought in by train. Andrew died at 56, age 56, but Mary and the children, who were all adult by then, in 1913 they opened a meat market in Sharon. And ironically, it was at the same location where Mary's father, John, was killed in that mining accident. I have no idea whether there was some kind of settlement that she got that property, or back then, I don't think the families got much when there was a mining accident. So I don't know how they came by that property, but that's where the meat market was. And it's right across from where Preston Ford's showroom is today, to give you an idea if you're familiar with that area. And this was their home at the time. And then this is a more recent picture of the slaughterhouse before, after it was closed, but before it was torn down. So. Now, the family always took vacations. They went every year to Rice Lake up in Ontario, Canada. And I actually have a picture here of Mary and my great-grandparents, and this is my grandpa Bob right down a little type here. I suppose this picture was taken about 1915. He was born in 13. He doesn't look very old there. But they would go to Rice Lake every year on vacation and fishing trips. And you can see they'd catch quite a few fish. These are all postcards that I have from when they were on vacation, and they would write home to whoever didn't go. So we could pass these around if you like, unless you're getting tired of passing stuff around. I thought those were interesting. The oldest one is 1929, and I think they go up to 44 or 46. They were on their way to Rice Lake in July of 1929, and she had a stroke near Buffalo. They did get her back home, but she died July 31st in 29. She was 74 years old. So. But the family continued to go to Rice Lake. In fact, there's postcards there from August of 29. So they must have went back up. Somebody went back up after her funeral. So. Okay. Does the name Bombeck sound familiar? Irma Bombeck, right. Mary Bombeck's brother was Henry. Her oldest brother was Henry. And his grandson was Bill Bombeck. And he married a lady by the name of Irma Frist. And I guess most of you remember her as Irma Bombeck. She was a famous humorous newspaper columnist and author. I never met her or her husband, but I did meet her father-in-law. They had a cottage up at Pymatuming, and it was a couple down from where my grandparents had their cottage. And we used to go over there and visit, and I remember meeting would be her in-laws when we were up there. So. Back to the Nye family, I would always ask Grandma and Grandpa if we were related to Bill Nye the Science Guy, but Grandma didn't even know who he was. So. I haven't found that connection yet. Okay, and now we'll bounce back to the Millers, Matthias Miller Jr., this second generation. And he grew up on that Miller farm. I passed a picture around of the farm. He eventually bought it from his dad. He worked as a miner there on the property. And he and his wife were both born in 1863. Again, set the time here. This was right in the middle of the Civil War. And she grew up on that Oaks farm that I was able to find on North Kill Ridge Road. So. And they were married in 1887. And they lived on that Miller farm. And again, they eventually bought it. And they had 4 children that they raised there. And in addition to the coal mining, he was very involved in the township. He worked as constable, clerk, and tax collector. And they too were very involved in that German Reformed church. And Cody, you have the pistol he carried as constable. So that's another piece that we have. So, and Ella died when at age 53. She died in 1917, and he remarried 2 years later to a lady named Ida McClure. And I came across this article of agreement when I was going through Grandma's papers. My grandma was the record keeper of the family, so even though these people were on my grandpa's side, she had the paper. This article of agreement is really a prenuptial agreement. And they signed a few days before they were married that everything he had before the marriage would remain his, and everything she had would remain hers. So I thought that was so odd in 1929 that you'd have a prenup. I really think the Millers were pretty well off with the mercantile and the coal mines and the farms. For him to do an agreement like that, and then some of the pieces of furniture and things that have been handed down through the family, very nice furniture. In fact, I brought with me, like you really want to see this, this is a chair. I have 8 of these that came from the Miller farm, Matthias Miller, and his daughter Marie, my great-grandmother, did the needlepoint on it. So, and I have 2 that have the needlepoint. The other 4 are caned, and then the 2 have no seat in them at all. They need to be redone. So. But we treasure these. And I also have a marble top table that came from the Miller farm. So I think they had, huh?
So does the cat.
Cat.
He uses it to jump
Oh,
up
the cat. Yeah, I had to clean the cat hair off of it.
What
before
about the
we
marble
had it.
lamp? Lord, what about the marble lamp?
That was Charlie and Marie's. They bought it for that table. So then he eventually, we'll go through some more about what happened on the Nye homestead, but in a minute. But Constantine's home, after Matthias retired and he and Ida were married, he bought the home of Constantine Nye and lived there until he died. And he died in 1940. Am I boring you all to tears? Are you finding this interesting? Okay, now we're on to the 3rd generation, so we are moving forward. Charles Henry Nye was my great-grandfather. This is also the generation that I knew. I knew 3 of the 4 great-grandparents that we're covering here. And he was one of 4 children born in 1888, and he would have grown up in this corner house where Denny's is on the Nye homestead, and he would have gone to trout school. In fact, I have one of his school books from 1894. Not much left. The cover's gone and the back few pages are gone, but he signed his name up here and it says that it was from his teacher in 1894. And he enjoyed playing baseball. In fact, and that's the baseball uniform that's over here. That's Cody's. It was handed down to him. There's a picture of him there in a uniform, but it's not the same one. He played for several community leagues and church leagues. Some of you asked what the SPRC is. Have you figured that out yet? St. Paul's Reformed Church. So they were still carrying on that tradition with the Millers and the Nyes, going to the German Reformed Church. He was so good, one of the major league teams recruited him to play ball. I think it was the Chicago Cubs. Is that what Randy told us? And he turned it down. At that time, he'd already started his family and was so involved with the store and the butchering business that he was obligated to stay home. And he really loved hunting and fishing. We talked a little bit about them going to Canada on fishing trips. But I never noticed this before, but up here at the top of this map, this is just Shenango Reservoir back here. So back then it was just the Shenango River. That really wasn't too far away. It was before the Hickory Plaza was built. That was all very rural at this time. And even at Cranax, they would hunt and fish where Cranax is at, and there was a pond there, and I have pictures of them playing hockey on that pond where Cranax is. So, anyways, he also was involved with the butchering business. As I said, he did most of the butchering there in the slaughterhouse. That was his primary function in the business, although he did work some in the store. He married Frances Marie Miller. We always called her Grandma Marie. And she was born there on the Miller farm. And when I went to the presentation at Hermitage Historical Society, I learned from the History Club kids that she was a member of the very first graduating class from Hickory High School. So she was the first class. They even told me she was valedictorian of the class. So I was quite impressed with that. But then I found the program from her graduation, and here she is listed at the top. There were only 5 students in her class. But this was from April of 1909. And they were married in 1912 at, guess where, the German Reformed Church. And I already said about where they lived. This is a picture of the store. And we only have 2 pictures. There's this one, and then just a little wee one that shows a couple boys sitting on the front steps. I was in Preston Ford one day, and they had a picture of the market, and I asked them if I could get a copy, and they were about ready to close. And I haven't stopped in to see if they still even have it over there, but I was very surprised to see that picture. So the man on the left is Frank Snyderwine. He married Grandpa Charlie's sister Irene, and they lived in this house in the corner with their mother until she died, and they continued to live there until they died. They lived out their lives in that old family home. And then the next one is the oldest boy, William. He made his home down near the store in Sharon. And then my great-grandpa Charlie is the one here with the apron on, and then his brother George. We don't know who the little guy is in the front. So. But that opened in 1913, that store. And later on they opened a store in Farrell, 1939, but it was only open until 44. But the Sharon store stayed open along with the slaughterhouse until 1958. And the whole family worked there. And even my grandparents worked there. So several generations involved there. Even my mom worked there some when she was in school. So. But Charlie was also a carpenter. And in the 20s, he took on the job of renovating these houses on the old family homestead. So if we go back to this map, or this picture, Andrew's house was here. That house over there and barn were located right here. Send it around. But anyways, the first thing he did was to move that house that had been here down here. It's kind of hidden in this grove of trees, but that was moved to the eastern end of the property. And he added indoor plumbing, bathroom, and he put a sunroom on the front of it. So there's a picture of the original house and the remodeled house. Then that left this area open, and he built his house here. He and my grandmother built that house in 1922. I have the contract that he filled out and signed to have the company build that house. Interestingly enough, it was the very first house in Hickory Township wired for electricity. They didn't even have electricity when they moved in, but the house had the wiring, so the township hadn't run electric out that far. Again, very rural area, so they had it plumbed for gas lights as well. So, but he was the first house in the township to be wired for electric. And then in 1940, they took on moving the barn. And they moved the barn from back here up to State Street, It was facing State Street, and they remodeled it into a house. It was an old horse barn, and they remodeled it. Oh, here's a picture of Grandpa and Grandma's house. What? It's all right. And then this is it's the only picture I have a beautiful painting of this house at home, but I didn't want to bring it in and risk something happened to it. It's falling apart. I need to get it reframed. But this was remodeled into a house in 1940. And my grandparents actually lived there. So, I'll send that around. Now, one thing is very interesting on this picture, if you come up and looked at it, there was sidewalk that connected all of these houses. And then even at one point, the youngest brother, George, built a house back here on the property. This is what is Mark's Music today. It's the only house that's still left. So my grandparents lived in this house when I was growing up. I would go there through the summer, spend a couple weeks, and I'd get up and have breakfast with Grandma and Grandpa. By then there was no one living, they were renting out Constantine's original house, so I didn't go over there. But mid-morning I'd venture up to my great-grandparents' house and mess around up there doing stuff. She was always out working in the garden and he was tinkering and stuff, so I'd spend time with them. And then she'd go in and we'd have tea and bread and butter with cinnamon sugar. Well, then I'd leave their place and I'd come down here to Auntie's house. I always called her Auntie. She was Aunt Irene. Would see her. Uncle Frank lived, I don't know when he died, but I remember him. But Auntie was here, and then Aunt Nettie lived back here. So I would just make the rounds. Grandma never worried about me. She knew that I'd eventually make my way back home. But it was great living, or being over there with all those relatives. Now, I mentioned about the store closing in '58. I found another article dated July of '64, and that's after the store had been sold, and they were tearing it down to build a gas station or something there. And here they discovered where that original mine entrance was, where my great-great-great-grandfather was killed. So it was interesting to find that article. No, it's further down. Oh, and one thing I always liked to do at my great-grandparents' home was feed the goldfish. She had beautiful gardens, and they had what we always called the lily pool. It had great big goldfish in it. She always kept a thing of rolled oats in the pantry, and she would give me rolled oats to go outside and feed the fish. So that was one of the things I liked doing. And they were very active again in that German Reformed Church, St. Paul's. And then he was a member of Rotary and Grange, Moorfield Cemetery Board. And I'll talk a little bit about Moorfield Cemetery at the end. He was also involved in the Township. He was an assessor, and then the World War II Rationing Board. He also served on the school board for Trout School, that little one-room school, and then the Hickory Township School Board. He served the Township Board for 18 years, and he was involved when they closed all of the one-room schools to centralize into a more central. I think they built 2 elementary schools to handle all the kids. So that covers. Oh, here's a neat picture. Whoops, too fast. This was my great-grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. And this little type right down here is me. My mom and dad on this end.
Wayne.
Yeah, she's holding my brother Wayne. And that was taken over, what's Tara now, that was the Golden Eagle at that time. So that was quite a few of the family in that picture.
Grandpa.
Grandpa Bob, I think, must have been taking the picture. He's not in it.
Cause
Grandma Jean's there.
Up in the corner there,
Yep.
top corner.
So that was a neat picture. He died in 1966. She lived until 81, but the property was sold and she moved in with my grandpa's sister and lived out the rest of her life there. She lived until she was 90. So. And now we move on to another set of great grandparents. And these ones didn't start out in Hickory Township, but they ultimately ended up there. John Alvin, he was always known as Alvin Riggleman, was born in 1879 in Hadley, grew up in Greenville. He really loved music. He played the harp, mandolin, saxophone, and the piano, and he actually built mandolins and sold them. And then in church, he was very active in his church. I know that he filled in for the minister when he was away, led Bible studies, he sang in the choir, and he would often play the harp or the mandolin at church. I also have a notebook at home. It's got, from 1934, I didn't bring it with me, but it's got his Bible lessons for like 2 months in it. Very interesting reading that. And Bertha Perrine was my great-grandmother. She was born, where else? Perrine's Corners. But then she grew up in Worth and Wolf Creek Township. At the time they met, he was working at what's Polk Center now, and then she trained as a nurse there. So that's where they met. And they got married in 1891, or 1901, and lived in Hendersonville. But then the 1910 census shows that they had moved to Grove City. And they were in a house at the corner of Center and Pine Street. And how many of you have read your latest issue of the Historical Society's newsletter? You probably already have read a little bit about Bertha and Alvin. I have one tiny, very faded picture of their house at Pine and Center. And I know they moved to Sharon in 1913, so this would have been before that. Grandma always told me, though, that this house and 2 others, neighboring houses, were joined together to make the Bashline-Rossman Hospital. I found a 1923 picture of the hospital, and if you look closely, you can tell the roof line of the house along Pine Street and their house on the corner match the house in the building in this picture, the hospital. And then after the 1930 renovation, the neighboring house on Center Street was added. So you can follow the roof lines there. They added on to the front of the house, but you can see how that hospital developed. When they lived in Grove City, she worked as a nurse at the Oddfellows home, and he worked at the Bessemer. And I always heard growing up that Alvin built an airplane while he lived here in Grove City. And we had pictures documenting that. The framework, here's the framework of the plane leaning up against the C.J. Robinson woodworking shop in Grove City. And Grandma said that was down by where Five Filer Brothers had their business. And then I have a picture where the framework was pieced together at Grace Church. And when I looked at that, I thought that's not really Grace Church, but doing the research, I found there was an original Grace Church that faced Grace Street. And then they built the new church on Broad Street, and then they tore the old church down. So this would have been pieced together once they got the pews out of the old church, but before they tore it down. So then I found in my grandmother's papers an article that my great-grandmother had clipped out of the Grove City paper from 1912 that talks about Elvin building this plane. And it was actually an exact duplicate of the French Blériot plane. And Blériot was a Frenchman who built this plane, and he was the first one to fly across the English Channel. And there was my great-grandfather making an exact duplicate. He never finished it, but it was sold, and Grandma always said that it saw action during World War I, reconnaissance missions. And beginning, well, a couple weeks ago, Mallory and I made a trip to Dayton, Ohio, and at the Air Force Museum, they had a Blériot plane. And this is what it would have looked like had it been finished. I also noticed the bicycle wheels on it. Who else was building planes at this time? You remember? Wilbur and Orville Wright. And their planes had bicycle wheels because they owned a bicycle shop. So I thought that was neat to see the finished product. In 1913, they moved to Sharon. He worked at Salvage Arms and then Carnegie Steel. And one thing or a couple things we have from him when he was working at Carnegie, I guess on the sly, a lot of the men made things that they brought home. He made these little tiny rings out of steel. And we have several of them. Sometimes they were monogrammed with an initial in the middle, but this one's Mallory's. And it doesn't have anything engraved in it. But it was interesting. I had a little one that fit my pinky finger when I was a kid. It's long gone. I don't know where it is. But he also had, it was the tinkering sort. He also had a radio shop, and he built and repaired radios in Sharon. In 1916, while they were living in Sharon, they adopted a 2-month-old baby girl, my grandmother, Jean. And going through the papers, I found a telegram, original telegram, and it's dated May 15th, 1916, and it's addressed to Mrs. J.A. Riggleman, and it says, "Escort bringing girl, due Sharon, 2:15 today at Penn Station in Sharon." So they were not, and it was, the time stamp was 10:14 that morning. So they got the telegram that their baby was coming that afternoon. Well, their house was on Prindle Street in Sharon, but during the Depression, they were able to rent out their Prindle Street house, so they moved to their country house, and guess where that was? Right out here at Trout's Corners. They had a house that was across the street from the Nyes, somewhere along here. So this would have been between Eaton Park and the Corners where their house was. So they ended up out there during the Depression. And Alvin died in 1936. He died unexpectedly of a heart attack. So Bertha had to return to nursing. The 1940 census showed that she was working up at, or living and working at St. Paul's Home in Greenville. And one of those postcards I passed around was addressed to her in Greenville. So she was up there. I just read that St. Paul's just celebrated their 150th anniversary.
You mentioned that the 2-month-old baby girl was her niece, right? Are you gonna get that?
I'll get to that.
All right.
So in 1948, Bertha remarried, and she moved to her new husband's home in Polk. His name was Sam Walker, but he died 3 years later. So she moved back to Hickory Township and made her home with my grandparents, who by that time were living in this house that had originally been the horse barn. Keep it all in the family. And she lived to the age of 87, died in 1968. So I remember Bertha very well too. Okay, we're getting close to the end. What time is it? taking way too long here.
No, you're not. You're doing fine.
Okay, my grandparents, this would be the fourth generation to be in Hickory Township. He was born in 1913. He was the second of 3 children, born to Charles and Marie. He attended trout school right there on the property. In fact, I found the 1921 souvenir book when he was in 2nd grade at trout school. And his name is right up here under 2nd grade. And he's actually listed too. Another one of the resources that's great is this Mercer County one-room school book if you're doing genealogy. But his name is actually listed in this book for trout school. But as you're looking at this, if you look on down, there's his dad, Charles Nye, listed on the school board. So I thought that's a pretty special piece too. He learned the butchering trade from his dad and uncles. So he grew up with that. I also found this notebook that he had, just a plain old notebook. And I have it turned to a page, June 1st, 1927. He would have been 12 years old. And here he was recording how many steers they bought, how much they paid for them, what the commission was, what the freight is to have them shipped. So at 12 years old, he's keeping those kinds of records about the business. I thought that was pretty interesting. Now Grandma, she's the one that was adopted by Alvin and Bertha. And again, she moved to Trout's Corners with her parents during the Depression. But she had gone to elementary school in Sharon, at the Case School, I think it was. But she graduated from Hickory High School in 1934. My grandparents met because they were living across the street from each other. They were playmates when she first moved out there. I always remember Grandma talking about how much Hermitage had grown up and Hickory Township had grown up. When they come out there to Trout's Corner during the Depression, she said State Street was 2-lane cinder road. It wasn't even paved at the time. So now it's 5 lanes. So they began dating while they were in high school, and then they got married, girl next door. And they got married in 1935, and they had one daughter, Roberta. Now here we are back with another tie to Grove City. They worked in the Nye's markets until the mid-50s when that business was winding down, and they purchased the Parkview restaurant in Grove City, and they ran that for 5 years. But they still lived in Hickory Township. They drove back and forth every day. They always spoke very highly of their employees. They remained friends with a lot of people from here, and they really treasured the memories they have of the customers they had while they were working, while they had the restaurant.
Where was the restaurant?
It's where that muzzleloader shop is, right across from the park.
Okay.
Once they sold the restaurant, Grandpa delivered milk for Deneen's Dairy and then Horvath Dairy over in the valley. And in 1963, he got a job working as a custodian at Hickory Junior High School, which had been the high school when he went to school there. And his graduating class was the very first class to have spent all 4 years and graduate from there. So he always talked about that. And then while he was working, I guess even when they had the restaurant, he also was a very skilled carpenter. And they built a cottage up at Pymatuming. He built a wooden boat. His dad helped him. My great-grandfather helped him quite a bit. And then they built a log house out at Clark. And they lived a few years out there. But then he started having some health problems, and by that time my mom and dad were living in Finley Township, and the house next door to them was vacant, so they bought that and moved to Finley Township. And he died in 2001, and she died in 2010. And now that fifth generation, my mom and dad. Mom was born Thanksgiving Day. Where? Bashline Rossman Hospital. The Rigglemans had been patients of the osteopaths at Bashline Hospital. They continued to travel back and forth to Bashline, and then my grandmother was raised in that osteopathic tradition. And so Mom was born at the Bashline Hospital, but again, grew up over in Hickory Township. My grandparents, at the time Mom was born, were renting a house further down State Street. It's where that ERA Johnson real estate was. But they were renting that house, but they then moved to the house that was made out of Constantine's horse barn in 1940. So Mom was just little when they moved. She graduated from Hickory High School in 1955. She worked in the slaughterhouse and some in the store. But I remember her telling stories about once they had, and the slaughterhouse was still there when I was a kid. I used to hang out there. It wasn't running or anything, but there was a lot of stuff there. They had these big copper kettles that they would heat with boiling water, and they would dip the chickens down in there, and then her job was to sit and pick the feathers off of them. So, I don't know whatever happened to those copper kettles. I remember them. So. And then she worked weekends at the Parkview restaurant after her mom and dad bought that. Then my dad comes into the picture. He was from Clarion County. How did he end up here? Well, in 1943, Dad's sister and her husband got the job, Bud and Reen Henry, got the job of managing the Bashline farms. And the Bashlines had 3 farms in Pine and Finley Townships. And those farms produced the meat, the produce, and the dairy products for the hospital. So he got the job there. Dad and his younger brother at the time were in foster homes. Our mother had died when Dad was 6. But in 1946, Aunt Reen and Uncle Bud had Dad and his brother Sid move to the farm with them. They had that big farmhouse. So it's just out 58, just past where Legacy, I think that's now the BFW. So it's that big old farm on the left out there. So he graduated from Grove City High School, because at that time they come into Grove City to school. And then he worked at Meadow Gold Dairy after graduation. So Dad was 16 when he came to Grove City. He continued to live there on the farm until 1955. And Mom, remember, was working at the restaurant. They had curb service. She worked weekends there. Dad was working for Medical Dairy. And one of the stops on his milk route was the restaurant. So that's where he and Mom met. You see them sitting out in front of the restaurant. And they got married in 55. So, and they made their home in Finley Township, and that's where my brother and I grew up. Dad worked at Hey John Trucking. He was at Grove City Bus Lines, Anderson Tours, and he retired from milk transport. When I was in junior high, my mom went to nurses training, and she first started working at Benetti's in Harrisville, where my daughter works now. And she hated working there, and she came to Grove Manor. It had just opened, so she came there to work. And then Dr. Easton hired her to work as his office nurse. And at that time, his office was located in the old Bashline Hospital. That had become the clinic after they moved over to the Oak Hill facility. And then after Dr. Easton retired, she worked for Dr. Doman.
Where was the Finley Township from?
It's right across from People's Gas. Cody bought that house. He just moved in August, so. Again, we keep it all in the family. And my brother has my grandparents' house right next door. So Grandpa and Grandma's house is the white one with the 3-car garage right across from People's Gas if you're going out 58 towards Mercer. And Cody's house is the next one. It's yellow with green shutters and 2-car garage. So he has that house. And we were all members of Center Presbyterian Church growing up. Dad was involved with the JCs in his younger days here, and Mom was a member of White Shrine. She died in 1994. She was only 56, and Dad just died last year. He was 85. So that is the end of the bit about my ancestors, but I said we'd talk a little bit about Moorfield Cemetery. With the exception of 2 couples, everybody I covered today is buried in Moorfield Cemetery. And if we go back to our map of the township, Moorfield Cemetery is right here. So kind of the center of the township. And back to these Mercer County history books, one of them says that this is one of the oldest and most noted cemeteries in Mercer County. And the 1909 history says it's one of the most picturesque and well-kept homes of the dead in the county. They also state that pioneers of the county, prominent citizens and soldiers from the War of 1812 and Civil War are buried here. World War I hadn't happened yet, so it only went up to the Civil War. And those not buried in Moorfield are right here in Grove City. Alvin and Bertha are buried in Woodland Cemetery, and Mom and Dad are out at Crestwood. So,
What road is Moorfield on?
it's off of the freeway.
518. Or 418. 418.
So if you go over to Hermitage and at the mall, turn left and follow that freeway. Downtown Moorfield is on the left off of the freeway. And then we keep going. I now live in Wolf Creek Township, where Bertha spent a good bit of her time. And both my kids graduated from Grove City High School, where Dad graduated. So I graduated from Mercer. Bob went to Grove City.
Ed Carlson was my social studies teacher.
I'm not that one.
So I really buzzed through that. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Jean?
You said there were 3 Bash Line farms.
Yes.
I never knew that. Where
Yes.
are the other 2?
The second one was the farm that you probably know, Bob Langle. Right when you get to the end of the 4 lanes off of 58, at 58 you turn right and go back there in Bob Langle's farm. That was where that was dairy farm, and they had a few chickens there. I verified this with Steve. Steve Langle graduated with me from Mercer, so I posted a picture of Uncle Bud in the Bashline Rossman Farms truck on our Facebook page here at the Historical Society. Dr. White, Betty Jo White saw that. They still have a Bashline Hospital Alumni Association gathering once a month out at Eaton Park. And they invited me to come and speak to their annual luncheon. And they wanted to know where all 3 of these farms were, and they wanted to know all about this house on Center and Pine Street. So I did a presentation for them last month, and I had to find where the other 2 farms were. So Alan Henry, my cousin Alan, Bud and Reed's son Alan, and their daughter Janet both gave me some information. So I started doing the research, and Steve verified that his dad had bought the property. He didn't remember for sure whether he bought the property from the Bashlines or whether there was another owner in there or not. So
That was the third,
that was the second one.
second.
But if you continue on, and I forget the name of that road. If you continue on that road and go back around where Paul McCausland had his farm,
I know where that's at.
those two farms bordered each other on the back sides, the Langle farm and the McCausland farm. That was the third farm, and it was all chickens, and it was all poultry.
Well, now, the Bashland farm, was it for horses? Jim McDowell told us a story about they would bring horses in from the west on the railroad. And then there was that barn that Humphrey has.
Yes.
And they would store them in there, and then after a while, they would drive them down another road.
I don't know about that. I know they had horses out there, and
Redwood train.
a lot of the doctors would bring their kids out to the farm to ride the horses. And Janet showed horses. Aunt Rena and Uncle Bud's daughter Janet showed horses. So they did have horses there. They had a lot of orchards, and Aunt Rena always had big gardens, so they would send. And it was funny because we were eating lunch out there, and I had my cousin Janet come over and attend this function with me. And I said to her, I said, did your mom, she always had these huge gardens. And I said, did she take those vegetables and the produce, the fruits from the orchard into the hospital? And she said, why would she take them in there? And I said, well, those farms were there to produce food for the hospital. And she said, where in the world did you get that idea? So that just blows my whole presentation. How am I going to punt through this? So when I started into that part of the presentation, I said, there's some question now whether that really happened or not. I had Aunt Rena and Uncle Bud's picture up on the screen, and there was one lady who had worked in the kitchen. She's 93 years old, I forget her name, and she said, oh, I remember Bud and Reen. She said they used to bring fruits and vegetables by the bushel basketful into the hospital kitchen, and I thought, whew. So then Janet calls me on the way home, and she said, how was I so stupid that I didn't know that my parents did that? And she said the big trucks would come in and take the cattle, and I think they butchered the hogs right there on the farm, but they would haul the cattle out. And she said that all went to Pittsburgh to be butchered. Well, it didn't. It was butchered locally. Surplus may have been sold, and the proceeds funneled back into the farm and to the hospital. But
Your dad and your Uncle Sid was in my graduating class.
Uncle Sid passed away last Monday. Yeah. He's been sick for the last about a year and a half. He's been sick, and he passed away last.
They would come into school almost late every morning because they had
Do
to deliver to the hospital before they come to school.
Yeah, and see, those were the stories I grew up with. But Janet, she went there when she was 14 months old, and Aunt Rena and Uncle Bud bought the farm across the road when she was 14. So, Yes.
When I was a kid, we would, go up there once in a while. And I was amazed at the double stairway, one in the front and one in the back. I had never seen that before. Beautiful, huh?
I can't say as I was ever in the house because they were out of there. I was born in 57, and I think they gave it up in 58. I don't know when Aunt Rena and Uncle Bud bought that, but my great-grandparents' house, the brick house, had a double stairway. There was a narrow stairway that went up from the kitchen, and then there was a wider, fancy one that came up from the living room, the front hallway in the house.
I think Bob Nye's Parkview Restaurant was the first, maybe the only place in town that ever had curb service.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I did the research for the Parkview Restaurant for the articles that appeared in our newsletter, Norm Humphrey's daughter said her dad had curb service, but apparently that was continued through the other owners of the restaurant. So Somebody told me they remembered too when they'd go across they'd be ice skating over at the park pond in the wintertime. They would allow them, my grandparents would allow them to keep their ice skates on and come into the restaurant and get hot chocolate. Yes?
I have a couple things about Hermitage that
Uh-huh.
might be of interest. One's kind of humorous. When I had the antique shop, I came across a Mercer County business directory for I think it was the 1870s something. And it had listings for all the businesses in Mercer County, and it came to Hermitage Corners and it said, no businesses. The other thing that I came across when I had that shop was 4 logs from clay furnace.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
those are now in the Canal Museum in Greenville. So if you want to research some,
Well,
Thank you.
actually, my mother wrote the story of my mule-driving great-great-grandmother, and she sent that up to the Canal Museum, and they have it in one of the display cases. When Cody was in 7th grade, he did a National History Day project on the canals, and we had to go up there to Greenville in the middle of the winter when the museum isn't open. I had to track down the guy that was curator of it. He opened it up for us to get in there and get a copy of that history that my mom had written. So we have been there. It's a very interesting place.
did you come across those 4 big?
I don't remember. I don't remember. We probably saw them, I just didn't commit it to memory. Any other comments or questions?
You've done a wonderful job.
Well, it's been fun. I bet my family's glad it's over because
Valerie.
if I passed around that one sheet that has some thoughts on it that I found interesting about genealogy, and the one little bubble on the back, it says floor, and what's it say? The definition of floor: the place for meticulously filing your priceless genealogy records.
Yes.
Just all around my desk is, and in the sunroom in our house. I have boxes everywhere. So now I have to concentrate on
Could
cleaning.
you explain what this is right here?
Oh, this is the Nye coat of arms. My grandpa's cousin, David Snyder one, got that. I don't know whether his wife painted that or what, but it was the Nye coat of arms. It was interesting. Their last name is Snyderwine. I showed the picture of Frank Snyderwine in there. He married into the family, married my great-grandpa's sister, Irene, the one I knew as Auntie. But in one of the census records, after Andrew Nye died, Mary hired Frank Snyderwine as a farmhand there, and he lived in the house with them. And Irene ended up marrying him, and then they lived the rest of their lives there in that house. So that's all I have. But I do encourage you, if you're interested in researching your genealogy, Jane Cleary is here. She's here every other Tuesday, right? Helping people. Second and fourth Tuesday, along with Kathy Calder. We have a ton of resources beyond what I have up here in the front. So.
Lauri, you gave everybody an excellent way of presenting a family heritage like that, because everything was kind of in 1, 2, 3 order, and the sheet made it easy to work with.
Well,
that's an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Presentation.
Well, and the book that I'm doing, I'm actually doing a narrative of this history. I'm up to 40 plus pages, and I cover a lot of the extended family in here as well. And I've sent this to my brother and to 2 of my mom's first cousins that are still living, and my cousin Linda passed away several years ago. Sent it to her husband for them to tell their stories, and so I can finish this up. and get it to the high school history club. That was the original goal, and they haven't got their history yet, so. And I told them I'd have it before the end of school in 2017. So they'll be lucky to get it by the end of school in 2018. So, but there's a lot more pictures in here, but I thought we had enough to pass around tonight, so I didn't bring them.
Great.
Yeah, I got a question here.
What?
This is for Ed Carlson. Okay, at the Parkview Restaurant, now, everybody always remembers the bad stuff. Nobody ever remembers the good stuff that happens. But Lauri's grandma was telling me one time that she was in there, and over there where the curb service was, there was a door there, like towards the back of the building, and there's a hallway. Well, Lauri's grandma, I don't know whether there was a window there, but anyways, this guy come in. She didn't mention no names. It might have been Ed Carlson. But anyways, the guy, he had Red Man. He chewed Red Man, and the guy did something in the hallway, and Grandma Jean seen it, and she got a
Spit.
bucket of, huh?
Spit.
Well, I didn't want to say that, you know. But she had a bucket of water out there, and little old Grandma Jean there, scrub it.
Another story that I
That you,
remember.
Ed?
No, I don't think so.
No
We
fibbing
went in
now.
there quite late.
No fibbing.
It
I
was a
remember
place where-
Dad telling a story that